Hey everybody, welcome back to the Yellowbox Podcast, Season 3, Episode 4. I'm here with Kevin Daughtry and Tristan Smith. I'm Nick Adjamoudi. So glad you guys are with us. This week, we're talking about this concept. And the idea is break the glass. Or maybe let's not break the glass. Kevin, you want to explain what we're going to dive into today?
Yeah, I mean, have you ever, we've all seen it. We were walking through like a public space, whether it be like a college, a university, a hospital, a school, wherever you're at, that's a public space that has a lot of people in it. There's going to be that, famous little fire, pull that triggers the fire alarm, and you have to break the glass to get behind it and pull the fire alarm and say signal emergency. Some of them have an axe behind there, so you can like break the wall open, like whatever you need to do, whatever it's going to do. You're going to signal an alarm when you do this. And you break the glass and you pull this lever, and it signals an alarm in the system that, alerts the fire department, alerts emergency services. Everybody starts rolling. And so really, I think what we do a lot of times in churches with creative is we treat the creative process like that. Like, I want you to imagine your creative team behind a glass. If you're the creative on the team, you're behind a glass. And let's say you're the leadership at the church, and there's something comes up. How many times is too much? Like, how much is too much? How much are you going to break the glass and then replace the glass to get an emergency thing done? And so, yes, we have a fire extinguisher. Yes, there can be emergency services, but we try not to break the glass, because if you were having to break the glass on a regular basis, let's say if you go into your school and you're constantly breaking the glass every day and pulling the alarm, those fines from the fire department are going to stack up. And they're going to eventually ban you from entering the facility. They're going to be like, sir, I'm sorry. Ma'am, I'm sorry. You can't come in, because every time you do, you're causing a public disturbance and you're costing us money. Well, you might not think about creatives in-house on staff at a church or an intern as money. But if they are making any money at your organization, you break maybe their salary, so you don't even think about it hourly. But if you broke down how many hours they did spend at the church, and calculate that to what their hourly cost would be, how much time do they spend on broken glass scenarios in your organization, putting out fires? How much time do they do? So yes, we can fight fires, but we're not firefighters. So we're going to dive in on a conversation about that today, and hopefully encourage both sides of the aisle. And I mean aisle, not that this is against each other, but there's leadership that breaks the glass. There's creative that break the glass. Everybody can be responsible for doing it. So how do we find a solution?
Yeah, that's so good. And I think really the first thing is, when we think about creative teams and we think about creatives, we should not view them as firefighters. And part of that is when we think about who they are and how they operate, like, let's not put on all of our gear. Let's not operate from a place of, man, we're here to put out the fires. Now, granted, there'll be seasons where there are fires, and we get that. That's why we do have the fire extinguisher. That's why our teams can put out the fires. But as a general rule, I like to say, like, let's leave the uniforms away, and maybe when the bell rings, then we can put on all our gear and go fight the fire. The other thing, though, is that there, within every organization, whether it be a church or a nonprofit or whoever it is that's listening to this, your organization has to define what is an emergency, what actually qualifies as an emergency, because we've all been in scenarios where, like, somebody call 911 or somebody break the glass, wherever that moment is. There's a spectrum for the tolerance of when that line gets crossed.
Right. God spoke to me last night. It's supposed to be blue instead of red, and it's supposed to have a squiggly font instead of a modern font. I'm just saying, like, this is an emergency. I got to break this glass.
No, listen, dude, I was with my dad just a couple days ago, and he had a fire going in his backyard, like a little fire pit, and he put some firewood on there, and it got so intense and big, and I thought to myself, and there were sparks flying, like, hitting the grass in the backyard, and I'm like, Dad, like, this is unsafe. Like I was on the line of, like, we need to go address this before this fire gets out of hand. Like, we're just a couple sparks away from it turning into like a grass fire in our backyard. Like, I'm like, what are you doing? Yeah. And he was just like, no, we're good. Like, I've got some water, like, he was so chill about it. But my point is, we treat creativity like that a lot of times, where Like we have to create a culture where there is consensus around when is there an emergency, or let me just say this, when is there urgency? When does there need to be a sense of urgency? Because I do think that there is such a thing as good stress within a creative team, right? But we have to define what is good stress, what is bad stress, and how are we keeping all of those things kind of managed through the process. And so ultimately what we're talking about here today is stewardship. And really stewarding kind of three things. The first is obviously the creative output of your teams. So what is it that we're producing? How are we stewarding that? That's usually kind of what the quote unquote end goal is for a lot of teams. Now, if we're doing it right though, we understand that people are the ones who we're also stewarding as well. So there's production, but then there's people kind of on the front lines. And really in ministry, the way that we see it is people are who you're ultimately responsible for, or responsible to God for. And there should be that making disciples piece of your creative team and your process. And how are you leading people closer to Jesus? And are they falling more in love with ministry and what they're doing in the process of it? Or are they getting burnt out? Are they getting run over? And how well are you stewarding that? Again, figuring out what's urgency, what's emergency, what's not. We've been a part of a lot of just big projects, campaigns, conferences, whatever you want to call it, within both the local church and then other just nonprofit scenarios where we kind of come through it on the other side, and you could be tired. But sometimes I think, Kevin, there's a difference between being tired and then just feeling like you just got run over. Like I've been exhausted, but so full and fulfilled. But then I've also been in scenarios where maybe we get through something and I'm tired, and I'm also like, why was that so painful for everybody?
Well, yeah, I mean, you got to determine, is this thing sustainable? And then if you're not able to have an honest look at the sustainability and the real impact of what some of those decisions are having on your organization and your team, and you're also asking yourself, why are people leaving? Like, why do we have such a high turnover? Like, you're missing the forest for the trees. Like, you're missing it altogether. Just imagine that. So this analogy, Nick, that you brought up. So imagine, we've all flown somewhere, and when you land and you're sitting there and you're on the runway and you're like about to get to the gate, and they're taking a minute to get to the gate, or maybe you're at the gate, but the gate operator hasn't pulled up the gate ramp yet. So you're just waiting. You're just sitting there waiting, and you can't get up. You're not supposed to, because technically the plane's not parked. And so, of course, you hear like the unbelting, everybody's unbuckling their belts, but imagine if you're sitting there and you're just so frustrated, right? You're so frustrated and you're so tired, and you're like, you know what, screw it. I'm just going to pull this emergency door and just go out the ramp. I'm just going to pull the sucker. I got to break the glass, or not. In this case, it's not glass. You just pull the little plastic off, you pull down, then push, and it triggers a big blow up ramp to go down.
Slide.
Yeah, it's a big slide. Everybody's sliding. So, I mean, if you do that, dude, you're going to set off so many alarms. You're going to trigger some kind of inspection, some kind of investigation. Like, you're going to trigger something, and you're going to be fined heavily and probably never be able to fly again. You're not going to just be like, oh, hey man, I understand that you were in a hurry. You needed this to get done. So we understand that you did this, and basically everybody else who was supposed to take that flight after you, that plane was going somewhere else, it's canceled. Like, it cannot be put back in service. They have to go back and inspect it, repack the emergency stuff. So imagine though, if you took that same approach. Like, we do that with creative all the time. We're on the runway, at the gate, waiting to finalize this whole process, and someone pulls the emergency lever and derails the entire thing for all the other people coming after. But we do it all the time. We don't even think about the excuses. We don't even think about the side effects of it. So think about it that way. Like, when you do pull the alarm, there are consequences, and those consequences may not be as severe in this scenario, as I'm kind of hyperbolic on that story. There might not going to be that kind of consequences. You're not going to get necessarily fined by your staff member for pulling the lever, but there are consequences that are unseen.
Yeah, it's good, man. I feel like that about just church in general. So like every Sunday, you have an opportunity to you're building culture. You just don't know whether it's good or bad, right? So like you add on to your culture, and you move in a direction every week, no matter what. The same is true for every creative project that you do, every series that you design, every worship set that you put together. you're building into your culture. You actually have an opportunity to take your culture forward with every creative project that you do. As you move creative projects forward, you're helping to build consensus. You're helping to build trust within your team of like, man, this is an emergency. Because the thing is, if it is an actual emergency and you can help build buy-in with your team to see that, hey, actually, I am going to need to put in extra hours, or we are going to have to do this or that, and everybody agrees and they see the same thing, man, that is so healthy in a culture for people to have that buy-in. But it really comes down to be like, man, are you pranking me? Is this boy who cried wolf right now? Like, you just pulled down the alarm. Is this a real fire? Or like, how many times have we been in school where the fire alarm was pulled and you're like, okay, is this a drill or is it not? And that happens, I think, so many times in organizations, and that's really where I think a lot of that quote unquote damage can be done in terms of just trust and all of those things within the culture. But the healthiest cultures are the ones where it's like, we know that the fire extinguisher is there and we will use it if we need to, but let's just have that consensus around that. And a lot of times, I believe that the urgency of the emergency can be avoided when we really take that extra time to look at our creative process.
Yeah.
When we ask ourselves, man, what is our creative process? Is it working for us now? And then maybe, is there a better way to do our creative process? Are there some things that we can build in so that we don't have to grab the axe and break the glass in the future? And so I would encourage everybody listening to like think through your feedback process of like, man, how are we giving feedback? Is there enough time? Or what are the turnarounds? Where are we lacking in some of these areas? And then if the process isn't serving both the output that you're producing and your people and your culture that you're creating at the same time, because like your process might be creating output, but it may not be adding to your culture. And so the change in the process actually could be for the betterment of the people and adding value to how your team operates. It's worth the change, because the people are the ones who are going to be producing the creative anyways. And so to me, it's like you have to have that balance within the process of making sure that your process is bridging the gap in a healthy way, moving both your people and your church creative forward.
Yeah. Well, it takes, if you're going to do good quality faster, it requires more people to do it. So if your entire system and structure is built around the idea that we know we have to be on our toes as an organization creatively, so we're going to staff, we're going to have 50 creatives on staff, and we're going to do this. We're going to pull it off. We got all the things in place to do it, because what, and you need to pivot. If pivoting like that is not possible to change, you're going to have to staff to pivot. Like, you're going to have to staff to be able to do it on the fly. Like, I had a conversation with someone this weekend who was asking me about some live production stuff, like live production. Do we need to take someone on the road to be like a production manager? And I said, well, you can do like remote like tests. You can go in and do like, hey, we're going to do a remote run through, work with the team on like, I'm going to remote into the system. We're going to go with the whole team. We're going to go through the whole program, everything remotely.
Sure.
And then I said, so that could happen. The only downside is, how often do you change stuff on the fly? Because and his answer was, oh, well, no, that won't work for me. And I'm like, totally, that's fair. That's not a hit. That's just, it's good to know. What are my boundaries? If I think I can do this remotely, but I like to be able to ebb and flow in the moment and change a few notes here or change a few things here, you need to be staffed for that. You need to be ready for that. You need to be prepared for that. And so we're not saying, don't be agile. Like, being agile is a great key for any organization to do. But if you're not agile and you think you are agile,
right,
and you're actually breaking the glass and you just don't realize it, you're doing damage, and it's hurting the team members. It's hurting your process. It's hurting your finances. It's costing you on a lot of fronts because you haven't set a system up to be agile.
So good. So okay.
One thing that
go ahead, Tristan.
Oh, my bad. I was just going to say, I've noticed like in a lot of organizations where they spend time preparing for, these emergencies and everything. Like, the more time you spend preparing, you kind of talked about it with like processes and everything, but that really, really means just getting in there and thinking through every possible thing that could happen. And the more you do that, the more freedom you're going to have to change things on the fly. in the case that it happens. And so that's one big thing that I've learned, because the biggest thing that I think you're going to lose when you continue to break the glass like that is relational equity. You're gonna lose team members like crazy, and that's just a safe way to do it. It's just constantly be preparing for that with the best, most optimistic like thought process, but still preparing for all those emergencies.
Yeah, for sure. Nick, you had said something earlier that was really, when we were talking about this podcast about, a healthy creative process. Like, obviously, if you want to kind of paint the picture, like there's a Venn diagram, right? Like this is something that's real. We've all seen it. We've all seen we've all mocked it. We've all looked at the memes, but like, walk me through, how would you explain to leadership or creatives in a church who have the ability to lead up what that looks like?
Yeah, so I mean, the process essentially is it has to be kind of agreed upon, not just by the creative team, but also by leadership. There's a partnership of coming together and saying these are kind of the rules that we need to play by together, and really both sides need to be happy with it. Like they need to feel good about the process. It looks different at every church. It looks different at every organization. Obviously, there's rhythms of communication and events and all those things that need to be planned. But as long as the process is clear and people are aware of, hey, these are some timelines we're dealing with. These are the different like areas of where we are in the process, and we're moving along, and there's clear communication on both sides. I think the biggest thing that I would say that a healthy creative process shows is like really great buy-in. And if there's good buy-in from both the creative team and the leadership team, or the people who are vested in it, you're going to have healthy creative output in the end, because ultimately it is about both sides buying in. I've seen that the best creative process are the ones where it's not where a creative goes and does something and says, hey, what do you think? It's really where there's a collaboration involved, both at the beginning, in the middle, and at the end, and a great feedback loop, great communication all around. And there's trust built within that too. And honestly, like there's love in the process. Like you have to ask yourself, man, where are we loving each other in our creative process? Because if there's love, then there should be no fear. And so, the Bible says perfect love casts out all fear. So when you begin to incorporate love into your creative process, what happens is fear gets eliminated, and then you're able to build on trust with one another and communicate from a place that's not fear-based. And I really think that breaking the glass, just hearing the shattering of the glass, is fear-inducing for a lot of people. You have to realize that we've all experienced trauma on some level. And so when everything goes to DEFCON 10, some people just do not respond well to that. So ultimately, when we're talking about breaking the glass, we're talking about doing something that can trigger trauma, something that can move people into their instincts, as opposed to a process that's laid out and been agreed upon. And so that's kind of my take. That's kind of my take on healthy creative process. My question for you, Kevin, is if I'm a leader, as we kind of wrap this thing up, if I'm a church leader, how would you challenge a church leader listening to the podcast today? That's like, okay, I understand, that maybe I've been breaking the glass, or I recently broke the glass. How can I get better? What would you tell them? Yeah,
I mean, at first I'd say, sometimes, like we were talking about earlier, it happens. Don't like shame yourself because it's happened a few times. But you do need to recognize that if this is a recurring process and it's happening 60% of the time, something in your process is not working. And so, or you don't even have a process. You're calling all the shots without any kind of buy-in or accountability to the structure or the team. And I understand like a lot of our church leadership structures look different. But having a little bit of accountability in that front, if you're not a creative, you don't understand how creative works, it's good to get some advice on how it actually works. So I would challenge you with this. If you're a church leader and you're listening to this, welcome. Thanks for listening. Glad you're here. I would say this, you need to learn the difference between inspiration and impartation. Okay. Right? So impartation being, I heard from God. Like God actually told me. He actually imparted this thing into me, dropped it into my heart. Like we've all had that moment where you're like, it was a release. You were praying for something, and there was an impartation, and you just got it. Like you knew that you knew that you knew beyond a shadow of a doubt this moment that this was an impartation from God. It's the writing on the wall moment, right? Like we all say, well, if I'm going to move there, God's going to have to write it on the wall, and maybe He did, which let's be honest, we would all crap our pants like if writing just started happening on the wall, right? But like the reality of it is, we need to know as leaders the difference between that, the impartation, and an inspiration. You can be inspired by a ton of things. I could be inspired by reading a book. I could be inspired by reading an article. I could be inspired by watching someone's social media post. I could be inspired by a trailer for a TV show. I could be inspired by a TV show. I could be inspired by something I just witnessed go down in public, or like I could be inspired by my children. I could be inspired by my pet. Like I could be inspired by a lot of things. That inspiration, you have to determine, is this the line in the sand? This was so inspiring to me that I can't wait 2 weeks to talk about it when we're actually going to have a normal end to this series that we've been planning for months. I can't wait 2 weeks to do it. I got to upset the system. I got to break the glass. I got to pull the alarm. I got to have people, spend their weekends developing a last minute series because I had an inspiration. You need to get some other ideas in there, get some other people in the system. Yeah. And so if you're willing to bet it all on this inspiration that might have been a very personal inspiration to you, you need to know the difference between inspiration and impartation. Yeah. Because if you're going to bet a lot of money essentially on it, if you're going to bet the resources of your team and ultimately the success of this campaign or the success of this marketing that you're putting money behind, you need to make sure that it wasn't just an inspiration for you that was meant to stay with you. There's a big difference. And so, the other side of that is obviously if you're creative and you're like, well, what do I do? Like I'm in this scenario. God bless you. Kudos. Don't give up. Like don't get frustrated. Don't get bitter. Don't turn to that because that's not going to solve the problem ultimately. And if you really do care about the organization you're serving and you have a place at the table to speak in a healthy way to lead up, then this is a good opportunity for you to make a way for yourself, make a way for a better, healthier process, and make a way for other people to come after you.
Sure.
And a lot of times this happens because there's an unhealthy process because no one's ever said, hey, there can be a healthier process.
Yeah.
It's not I'm going to do this because I want to kind of scenario. A lot of times it has to do with lack of knowledge and lack of experience. Like I'm not a pastor. I run a creative agency that services churches. There's a reason for that. I recognize that this is where I'm more geared. So you have to also recognize in your pastor and your leader that they're not running a creative agency. They're pastoring. It's a very difficult job. So give them that credit. But if you are a creative, you do need to learn the art of pushing back in a healthy and respectful way, because you need to lead up, ask the questions. Is this worth breaking the glass? If we've talked about this process, what comes up to this line everybody understands the possible ramifications of doing this, the extra cost, the overtime that's going to be involved in it. Sure. Let's pretend that you do have overtime when you work for a church. Like all of those things that are going to be involved in it. Is it worth it? And if everybody says yes, okay, let's go in. We're going to do this. We're going to put this fire out. We're going to break the glass because this is an emergency that we've all agreed upon based on our mutual understanding of what that means. Yeah. This is that scenario. But for everybody involved, I would say this: creative work takes time. Yeah. It's a craft. It's not an emergency services program. It is a craft. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That being said, you can prepare for emergencies creatively in ways that don't break the glass.
So good. That's so good. And I'll just add on to that real quick by just saying, if you are a church leader, like a lot of times it's good to meta communicate what you're sharing. So if you say, man, I'm really inspired by this, then this falls in the inspiration bucket. And then when the team hears that, they don't take it as gospel. But if you say, man, I've heard from God, I had oatmeal with Jesus, and these scriptures are where we're going to land, and this is where we're going for, that's impartation. Great. In anything, we need to know what's sacred and what's not, right?
Right.
And so that helps us as creatives to figure out, man, where can we push back? So great, we're going to preach on Beatitudes, but maybe let's not go with this particular idea, but we're still going to live in that space. So you kind of have to, but you, as the leader, you have to give the permission to say, hey, this is inspiration, this is impartation. Speak into the inspiration. Anybody else inspired? Let's come up with some other ways we can help share this gospel, to share this message where God is leading us as a church. Leaders, please do that. Share that and over communicate that, and then empower the team to say, man, I trust you guys to also bring some ideas to the table, because the best creative is when the best idea wins. It doesn't have to come from the leader. It doesn't have to come from the leader. And I think maybe that's a great place to stop. But thank you guys all for being listening. If you're getting anything out of this, or if you have any questions or follow up, please shoot us an email, hello@yellowbox.co, or you can hit us up on the Instagrams at Hello Yellowbox. But we're so honored that you guys would just take a few minutes and hopefully have been inspired and maybe a little bit challenged just to get better. Let's get better, creatives. Let's get better, churches. We exist to develop creativity in the local church. We're Yellowbox, and we will see you next week.